Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Dalia Rubiano Yedidia, and I'm with the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. And today's webinar will be interpreted. So I will be passing it over to our interpreters to share with us about how to do that in language justice.
Les damos la bienvenida. Mi nombre es Dalia Rubiano Yedidia y vamos a tener interpretación en el seminario web de hoy, así que vamos a pasar la palabra a nuestro intérprete para que nos dé las instrucciones y nos hable de la justicia lingüística. Hi everyone, my name is Melody Gonzalez and I'm here with Lluvia Cárdenas and we are community interpreters and we will be interpreting today's session. And so in a moment, Dalia will activate the interpreting feature and everyone will receive a message that there's interpretation available. And we're asking everyone to select the language, either English or Spanish, the language that you feel the most comfortable to participate in fully. Mi nombre es Melody González y estoy aquí junto con Lluvia Cárdenas y somos intérpretes comunitarias. En un momento, Dalia va a activar la función de interpretación y les vamos a pedir a toda persona que por favor seleccione el idioma en el que prefiere participar para poder participar plenamente. And just we want to remind everyone that language justice is a shared responsibility. And so what that means is that anytime anyone is speaking, we want everyone to be mindful that there's interpretation happening and therefore let's be mindful of speaking at a moderate pace, spelling out any acronyms so that everything can be interpreted with the highest precision possible, especially for our English speakers, because from English to Spanish takes a lot more words and sentences sometimes to say the same message from English. So we really appreciate it. And we'll let you all know if it feels a little bit too fast. Les queremos recordar que la justicia lingüística es una responsabilidad compartida, así que por lo tanto, en cada momento que una persona esté hablando, les pedimos que por favor sean conscientes de que lo que se está diciendo se está interpretando al otro idioma. Por lo tanto, hay que estar conscientes de la velocidad, de los acrónimos, y esto es especialmente para las personas que hablan en inglés, ya que al español a veces se requieren palabras y frases más largas para decir el mismo mensaje. Okay, so I think we can go ahead and activate the feature and we'll give everyone a moment to select their language. Vamos a activar la interpretación y darles un momento.
The globe is not showing.
Hi, Laura. I'm hearing you say the globe is not showing on the bottom of your screen yet. Is that correct? Okay, let me look
There, I
into
see it
just a
now.
moment.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, great. Can I get a thumbs up from people in the English channel and Spanish channel that you can hear me? Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone, for your patience with this. Again, my name is Dalia Rubiano Yedidia, and I actually was a community interpreter in a previous life. And so it brings me much joy to be able to be here with you all today and have this workshop with you and have it be interpreted. So today we're going to talk about planned giving and fundraising for community land trusts. I am the movement and capacity building strategist on the housing team at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. And I'm here today with Stacy Lauman and Lori Lipstein, who will be presenting today on these topics. A little bit about the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. We offer capacity building trainings that are open to the public every Thursday from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. Pacific. And so these are webinars live and recorded. And the trainings range from skills-based trainings like how to use pivot tables in Excel, to fundraising, to engaging different audiences with online communications, and plenty of other themes. And so I'll drop some links in the chat in a moment. If you're interested in learning more, you can sign up for the newsletter if any of the trainings look interesting and important for the work that you do. And so today's webinar came about as part of our fundraising series. We've been working with Thread Strategies to offer fundraising trainings for our housing grantees. And we've also been working closely with the California Community Land Trust Network on capacity building. So we want to thank them for their partnership in making this webinar happen today. I'm going to share my screen now, the slides. Just a moment. Bear with me, thank you. Okay, I'm going to read to you about our speakers and then I will share the slides. So another piece today that I'll just share is I'm in San Diego as part of the Housing California conference, and maybe some of you are as well. And so I'm in a different setup than I normally am. So I really appreciate the patience. So first today we'll be hearing from Stacy Lauman, who's the Deputy Director at CLAM, which is the Community Land Trust of West Marin. Stacy has worked on affordable housing and land use policy at the Marin County Community Development Agency, and she's also managed real estate and development projects for Habitat for Humanity of Greater San Francisco. Today, Stacy is going to share with us about a few innovative models for planned giving that CLAM has used, along with some case studies. And then after we hear from Stacy, Lori Lipstein will speak, and she is the founder and principal at Thread Strategies. Lori comes from the nonprofit field, and now with Thread Strategies, she and her team support organizations so that they can break down funding barriers that small nonprofits face and maximize their impact. Thread Strategies also led a fundraising series specifically for housing grantees, and it included 5 about 30-minute videos on different individual giving strategies. So I'll also drop a link for those videos in the chat. I know some of you here participated in those office hours and watched the videos, and they are open for everyone to see. So with that, I'll share my screen and pass it over to Stacy.
Great. Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. It's nice to see so many folks here. As Dahlia mentioned, I work with CLAM, and we are a land trust out in West Marin, and the context is a pretty rural setting. It's a very small community. I think, you know, in total, if you kind of gather the population of the surrounding area, it's about 5,000 people. So it's not a lot. But we are a very strong organization supported by about 400 individual members of our nonprofit, of our CLT. And we work essentially to bring affordable housing opportunities to the communities surrounding Tomales Bay. We've been in existence for about 22 years now, but it took some time for our CLT to acquire our first property and multiple properties. And today we're talking about planned giving. And I think this really kind of is a leading edge for our next phase. We have several different projects in the works, but some of our focus now is really thinking about how can we partner with community members to make housing work in this very low density setting, rural setting, and in a place where the population is overwhelmingly elderly. I think the average age in our area is about 60, over 60 or 65. So there are a lot of people in the community that came to West Marin in the 70s because it was affordable, because it was kind of free and open. And now those people are really thinking about, okay, what's next for their latter chapter in life, and how do they manage their housing needs, their assets, and how do they think also, a lot of people are extremely community minded out in West Marin. And so people are thinking, how do they leave a legacy, or how do they support the community vitality that was very present when people moved to the area and is becoming less that way now that there are lots of second homes and investment properties and short-term rentals and things like that. So that's kind of where CLAM is in the world of CLTs, and kind of where we came to this focus on planned giving and also working with our community members. And one thing that we started saying to folks is that, you know, and everybody can participate. whether you have money to donate to the organization now, or whether you have time to donate to the organization, or expertise, or you have real estate or assets that you can't donate now. You could also do that after you pass away, or in some form. So that's kind of the frame of where CLAM got to the plan giving approach. So, why plan giving? I told you a little bit how we came to this focus. And I think, for the CLT, we want to take homes out of the speculative market. We want to make sure that we capture affordability to the extent that we can in the community. As I mentioned, it's pretty low density where we are. So we know that small site acquisition is our only way forward. Essentially, there is very little multifamily zoning or housing opportunity in our area. We also think that preserving communities' foundation, both with young families and elders, is really important to the vibrancy of the place. So we're looking for opportunities that bring mutual benefit both to the CLT and to the community members wherever they are in their life. And then, of course, we want to do real estate transactions with people that are cost effective for us, both in the short term and in the longer term. So we think about these things from a heart perspective, a community's perspective, but also just sort of a basic cash asset question. And do these things work for us on the short and long term? And then, plan giving for the donor. I think a lot of folks that have identified CLAM as a recipient of something in their will are legacy building. They really believe in the value of place, and they want to do something to sustain that over the long time. Also, I think there are some people that maybe they don't have heirs and they're not sure what to do with their assets. So, coming to CLAM sort of gives them a landing place and a little bit of feeling of being settled. Some people have financial need in the short term, and this really helps with that. And then, as I mentioned before, I think people feel like they want to contribute to the organization. They want to contribute to sustainability of the community, and this is one way that they can do that. I'm sorry if I was speaking too quickly. You can let me know that, interpreters. Great. Okay, next slide. So when we were thinking about, how do we sort of expand on our small sites program? How do we acquire properties, but, not by just going out in the real estate market, but doing, another alternative approach? We thought about, what are the kind of scenarios in which we could sort of ask for property or identify property to bring to us. So here are some scenarios. I'm sure there are many more that are not here, but, these are just a few that we've identified. And I also want to mention that, CLAM is just also in our infancy in this area too. We've really only, I think, received to date 2 planned gifts. And we have several people that have identified CLAM as putting us in their will. But so we're just learning too. So if other people have ideas on how to expand these approaches or scenarios, I'd love to hear that later when we have a conversation. So I'll just run through these scenarios first. So the most basic one is a gift upon death, where the owner doesn't need any income now, but they would like to give their property to the CLT. And so they put their asset in their trust, and then upon their death, it transfers to the recipient. Another option is that the owner doesn't need income now either, but has some desire to leave money to an heir or something like that. And so, could you go back, Dahlia, one? And so, so they would name the trust with an option to purchase their property upon their death. Another scenario that we're actually working with is an age-in-place scenario where the owner needs additional retirement income now, but wants their asset to go to the CLT when they pass. And so you might purchase the property today, but allow them to stay in the long term. And that way the donor gets some cash to maintain their life, but then you also as a CLT have security of receiving the asset when they pass. And similar to that would be a reverse mortgage or a reverse CLT purchase, where the donor needs some cash to live on right now. So the owner would sell or transfer their property to a CLT. The CLT could split the title and then hold the ground and then sell the improvements back to the homeowner with a perpetual ground lease, as in a typical CLT model. And in that way, the donor would retain ownership of their property, but the CLT would retain ownership of the land. And then through the ground lease, it would be converted to a permanently affordable home. And then, of course, sometimes people, maybe they have stock, maybe they have jewels, maybe they have, whatever, something else that a CLT may not necessarily be able to use in their mission aligned work, but you could also, receive those gifts. And Lori probably has a lot more information about this type of situation, but, you may receive a gift as part of a planned gift approach to end of life gift, then that would be converted into some sort of monetary value for the CLT later on. Next slide, please. So these are 3 case studies that I'll tell you a little bit about CLAM. These are 3 different projects that CLAM is currently working on that represent a few of those scenarios I just mentioned. So the first scenario is called Cypress. I've named them each a tree relative to their property. On the Cypress property, this is a woman that has worked in the community her whole life. She was a teacher and now she's living on a fixed income. She built this home with her former partner and now she wants to stay in the home, but she doesn't make enough income on her fixed income, Social Security, to be able to maintain her property and also live as she needs to live. So she came to us and said that she needed to find a solution. Otherwise, she would have to leave the community, but she didn't want to. And she knew that she could sell her home for about $1 million or more, but didn't want to do that. And so we really had to ask her, what do you need? What do you need to stay? How can you make this work for you financially? And then we had to determine whether that was something that our organization could help meet her where she was. And so we determined that, yes, we could. She also has 2 other rental units on the property. And so she receives rental income from those tenants, which makes her whole in terms of her income. But she had significant termite damage. She had a failing roof. She has a failing septic system. And a lot of the structures on her property were not permitted. So she was also at risk of being red tagged or getting in, some planning complicated issues. And she didn't really feel like she had the wherewithal to deal with all of those issues. And she didn't have the resources to improve them. So we agreed that we would purchase her home for $350,000. And we would also undertake and pay for the improvements that were needed that amount to about $150,000. And we would also help her permit her unpermitted structure and get her ADU in particular up to code. So she would have better protection, both in terms of insurance and, all of the above. So, the deliverable was that the owner is able to remain and the tenants are able to remain, which is great because this is a case where if she had to sell the house on the market and move elsewhere, that would have been 3 households in the community that would have been displaced. So we're able to keep her where she is. Her tenants are staying where she is. We were able to improve her property and her property will come to CLAM after her death. And so we used something called a retained life estate as the real estate vehicle to do that. And there are some reasons why we chose to do that, have to do with property tax, et cetera. I won't get into that now, but you need to kind of, when you're doing these things, you got to look at sort of up and down the stack, like where is the implication? Would her property tax change? Would this change or would the valuation cause any issues? So little details made the difference in deciding here. Okay, the next case study is the FIG property. And in this case, a long-term donor to our organization wanted to leave her home to CLAM. She also had a niece that she wanted to provide for after her death. And so prior to her, while she was of sound mind and of sound body, we agreed with her that she would put in her trust an option to purchase. So we said, okay, well, I think that for our organization, the purchase price of about $500,000 or 2/3 of the appraised value, whichever is less upon your death, because we didn't know how to forecast what the cost would be in the future. So we said, however this might be, cost, we will put that in your will, and then upon your death, we will receive the property and do the necessary improvements and then rent it out. So in this case, she did pass away. We have purchased the home for $500,000, and we're doing about $250,000 of construction improvements, including adding a tiny home in the backyard. And so now we are about to rent that property out. And then the third option, or the third scenario, is not really a planned gift, but it is a bargain sale. And I think it's valuable to point this one out in this context because this person had some significant financial shortfalls in his own portfolio, and he determined that he needed to get rid of this property and was preparing to sell it on market. So we had to quickly work with him to make an offer, and he went and determined with his own financial people that doing a bargain sale would work in his case. So we purchased the home, we're doing construction improvements, we're adding an ADU, and in this case, this person was able to get out of foreclosure on another property of his because he sold this property to CLAM. Next slide, please. So I know that in a conversation like this, looking at a table can be a little bit challenging, but I thought maybe this would be useful to outline later after this meeting. If you're thinking about how these options work and what are the risks and capacity needs and what are the benefits and risks, you can sort of look at this table. And this is what I tend to think about when we're looking at opportunities like this. So I'd like to just point out one scenario, and that's the age in place line. So I've organized this as on the left-hand column. There's the real estate transfer scenarios that I just talked through previously. And then the columns to the right are, what are the upfront costs to your CLT? And is this something that you want to take on now? Is this something you want to put money into at this time? And then what is the immediate revenue, if there's any revenue to offset? So if you need to take out debt, for example, how much revenue you're going to have to cover your debt? The next column over is owner collaboration and involvement. And by that, I mean, how much do you need to handhold somebody today in order to make the transaction viable? The next column is what kind of real estate mechanisms would be needed to put this scenario in place? And then the last column is, what is the risk to your organization? And how much management capacity do you need to have? How much time on the back end will you need to make sure that you're stewarding the asset appropriately? So in the age in place scenario, the third green box down there, I want to talk a little bit about the Cypress deal that we did with the woman that had the termite damage and this damage and that damage and the new septic system needed. So we knew that we could accommodate a certain upfront cost, but not a huge upfront cost. So we negotiated a purchase price, as I mentioned, was $350,000, but we broke that out into 3 payments so that we knew that she would get an upfront payment in year 1, and then a year 2 and year 3 payments so that we could catch up with our fundraising, and we didn't need to put that pressure on ourselves all at once, which that was very helpful. We were able ultimately to fundraise, and this will maybe talk into Lori's points, but people were so excited in the community around this project that we were able to fundraise everything in the first year, but we didn't want to assume that. And so that's why we pushed the payments out, and we're able to pay for the capital improvements and sort of manage our money as we go. Immediate revenue to CLT with age in place, we're taking on about a $10,000 potential cost to our organization annually for this particular project because of the agreements that we made with the owner. We're paying her property tax, for example, and we're paying for some of her maintenance. So we knew that even though we don't have any income immediately for this particular project, it's the value of the asset to our organization is high over time. And so we're able to absorb some of that immediate cost for future benefit. The next point about owner collaboration involvement, it was really excellent to work with the donor. Her name is Bobby Loeb, and we worked really closely with her and very transparently with her to make sure that she was making her own decisions about what she needed. And we were making our own decisions as a CLT about what was viable for us. And so we worked out, we negotiated together, but in the best sense of the term, in terms of really identifying her needs and our needs and making sure that all needs were met in a way that was mutually beneficial. But at the same time, it takes a lot of hand holding, and it's a very high staff time investment. So I think, I'll talk about this a little bit later in terms of the criteria, but one of our criteria is making sure that we come out of anything with more than one house, more than one dwelling, because there's so much time intensive work to put these deals put together up front that we need to have more than one unit to make it sort of, make sense from our staff time perspective. And then in terms of real estate, in that deal, we used a retained life estate, but you could also do a few other things like a CLT, reverse CLT purchase or reverse mortgage. We determined that a retained life estate was best for Bobby and best for us. And in order to do that, we did not need a broker, but we did use a real estate attorney that's with Common Space CLT, actually. And then we spent a fair amount of time in relationship with Bobby. Recently, she had a tree down. Recently, there's a problem with her septic system in the rain. We're doing permitting and construction on her property. So there's a lot of back and forth. I feel this is valuable for our organization because it's now our asset to look after. So even though we aren't receiving revenue from it and we are not technically in ownership at this time, we're still looking after the asset to make sure that it's maintained, it's not leaking and things are doing well so that we can transfer it to a low-income home owner or home renter when the time comes. And I should mention that on that property, two of the households are at or below 50% AMI, and one is below 100% AMI or below 120. So we were able to receive some local housing trust fund dollars to purchase and rehab the property. I don't want to go over the rest of the plan gift scenarios, but if people have questions after, I'm happy to do that. Next slide. So I wanted to share this because it's just an example of what my organization was thinking about when we were putting together this planned giving strategy, particularly around age in place. And we wanted to know that we had some decision-making criteria before we started advertising or marketing the opportunity in the community so that we were able to answer questions when people came forward. We weren't sort of shuffling around in the background wondering what to do with a question. So we know that, an older donor is better. We want someone, like, as I said, that a multi-unit property because it's cost effective for us to manage. We want something that's like reasonably maintained, not a ton of critical repairs, pretty good energy efficiency, or we can upgrade. We'd prefer to serve homeowners that are also low income, but also have a very high alignment with CLAM's mission. One thing about heirs is it's really important to make sure that heirs are aware of any arrangement that you've made with their loved one, and that if there are any questions, that those questions are clearly answered both by their loved one and by the CLT. And in fact, in the case of Bobby's home, her heirs signed the purchase and sale agreement to confirm their agreement that they would not be receiving assets from the property in the future. And how much, subsidy is needed to bring the property on in the first place. And also if you need to convert it to ownership or something in the future, what is the threshold financially? And then what kinds of long-term funds are necessary to maintain or manage the home. So those are just some of the criteria that we are using, but it was really helpful to go through the exercise with our board and our committees, so that when folks are going out in the community being ambassadors for CLAM, they too are sort of thinking on the long lines of what's feasible. I recently had a community member come to us offering her home as a planned gift, and we're turning it down because it's not in the right location. It's not, it'll be very costly to upgrade the property, and the donor probably isn't mentally able to manage the property from now until her next housing situation comes about. So it just seems a little precarious for our organization to get involved in someone that is having trouble making personal decisions. So that's another thing to look out for when you're looking into planned gifts. Next slide. So this is just a summary. I think it's really important to know your donors. Maybe somebody's interested in giving a planned gift today, or maybe somebody's sort of thinking about it or doesn't even know that that's an option. So just keeping that open, being transparent and vocal about the opportunity has really, for our organization, elevated this as a solution for many people in the community, and we're getting pretty regular calls about this. So maintain your relationships, and then if possible, as I said, confirm with heirs if they're, that they're aware of any arrangement. And then, from the financial security point of view, make sure you run your pro formas, both in the short term and in the long term scenarios. We try to look at both ownership and rental future pro formas, because in some cases, we're not sure what the best scenario will be for a property by the time it comes to us. So kind of looking at what the property needs and how it might be utilized in the future is valuable. And then also, there are situations where a planned gift to your organization may not be beneficial to the donor or to your organization, but there are other ways to also create sustainable, affordable housing in your community. So for example, maybe there's a property owner where a planned gift isn't right, but they have also a property that could have two households. So maybe they need to make it some co-ownership arrangement, and that's how they could sustain themselves longer term. Or maybe they could add an ADU in the backyard and then have a separate household, and that might be feasible. So in those scenarios, there could be a win-win, even if the property doesn't ultimately come to your organization. And that's it for now. Thanks.
Talia, I saw there were a lot of questions in the chat that were specific to Stacy's presentation. Do you want to pull out a few of them for Stacy before I get into the raising funds piece?
Yeah, that would be great. So Stacy, thank you so much for that thorough overview. There were a couple questions that were specific, one around if a reverse mortgage is necessary for age in place, and then also what type of estate planning or plan giving education does CLAM do for the community to consider these options?
Yeah, so I'll take the second question first, and that is, we do not provide planned giving education in the community. There are probably two reasons for that. Number one is just bandwidth. And the other one is that I think it's important for folks to get their own advice and to talk with their own financial person, with their own estate attorney about what makes sense for them. It's really important in my mind that CLAM doesn't give any advice around future planning on an individual basis. However, What we do is we have information on our website. I think we have a little bit less information now than we used to have, but we did list some ways or mechanisms where people could work with us around plan giving. And then I think also we've really gotten a lot of mileage around that Cypress example, where we ended up being in the local paper, on the local radio. We were picked up by the Chronicle. We were picked up by the Financial Times and somebody else. Like big papers were interested in that sort of innovative solution. And so I think people got really interested in word of mouth, sort of spread the word there. And so we now make sure that our board members act as ambassadors and talk about that option with their friends and family. And when we're out at events, we always mention it as well. And what was the first question?
That's great. Yeah, and then the next two questions, I'll go. The first one was, is a reverse mortgage necessary for age in place? And could this plan giving one of these models work for a person who owns a condo?
Gosh. Yeah, a reverse mortgage is definitely not necessary. I would have to ask some of the attorneys in the group about that, but in the case of, so in the one age in place that we did, we used a retained life estate instead of a reverse mortgage. We actually paid off her mortgage, but she didn't, yeah, so anyway, but I think in a condo situation, I think it would be the same, but you'd have to talk to a real estate attorney about that.
Great. Thank you so much, Stacy. So there's a few more questions that I'll highlight at the end, but we'll move it over to Lori now. And thank you also for all the comments in the chat. Take it away, Lori. I'll share the slides now.
Great. Well, hi, everyone. Again, my name is Lori Lipstein. I am with Thread Strategies. We are a fundraising consulting firm that specifically works with small nonprofits to build their fundraising capacity, which means the ability to raise funds within your team, not to be constantly relying on consultants to do the work for you. And so I'm here today to talk a little bit, very high level, about some of the funding options for how to do some of the work that Stacy just covered. Any one of these topics that I'm about to talk about could be multiple session trainings and are often multiple session trainings when we get into the tactics of doing the work. So my intention today is to really just cover high level what it means to think about different funding mechanisms and how you might want to consider which one is right for you. And then certainly once you decide which kind of fundraising you're going to do, like Dahlia mentioned and had put in the chat before, there's some other recorded resources that CZI has on some of these topics. And certainly I invite you to feel free to reach out to me if you have other questions. Stacy covered plan giving and bequests a lot in the scenarios that she was sharing, and that's when a donor makes plans to leave the property to the organization in their will. But you may have also noticed in some of the scenarios she shared, there were situations where the organization was also putting up money to purchase something, either purchase the property fully or in partnership with the bequest piece in some way. And so you might not always just be able to rely on the entire gift coming to you as a full bequest in the will. There might be some fundraising that you also need to do to make some of these acquisitions possible. And when you think about fundraising for the projects, you can think about it in two kind of big buckets. One would be a per project fundraising where, let's use some of Stacy's examples. You have the Cypress property, you have this opportunity to acquire it. And actually, I don't know if I'm lining up the names of the property with where you actually had to spend money now that the slide's not in front of me, but let's just, pretend that was one where there was an acquisition to be paid for. And so maybe you're doing a per project campaign where you are taking the story to your donors, to your funders and saying, we have this opportunity to acquire this property. We need X amount of money to do so. And we're asking for contributions to make that possible. It's probably how most of these opportunities get get funded, I imagine, at least in some conversations with Dahlia and her experience. I know often it's this, an opportunity comes up, you didn't know it was coming, you need to quickly get the funding for it to make it possible, and you're kind of constantly in that cycle of responding, if you will. The other scenario I'd like to propose to you all to consider is kind of doing a proactive campaign, a fundraising campaign, to seed some sort of acquisition fund or whatever you might want to call it, where you're doing a little bit of a longer, more proactive campaign where you are talking about scenarios of future purchases. You might not know what they are yet right now, but you are doing that fundraising proactively towards future opportunities where you're seeding a fund that when those opportunities become available, then you already have the funding to move forward with them instead of doing a per project in the moment fundraising. Probably some combo of all three of these is the reality of what a lot of organizations will and could do. And so I'm just going to do some best practices kind of on each of these pieces, and then I'm happy to answer questions if it's helpful. So Dahlia, if you could move to the next slide. Stacy covered a lot of the plan giving pieces and some of the best practices already. So I'll just highlight a few of these again from the fundraising perspective, which is the seat that I always sit in. And the high level piece I want to focus on is that as the fundraiser, your job is to talk to the donor about impact and legacy. And I know a few people were also commenting on that concept in the chat earlier. You are not their financial advisor, which is what Stacy has already said. It is not your job to talk them through the financial implications of the gift for them personally, or even the financial mechanisms with which they're going to make the gift. As Stacy mentioned, there's a lot of potential conflict of interest on that front, not to mention that that's not the function that you're serving an expertise in. You're engaging your own experts in the financial side for your organization, and they should be engaging their own experts and advice on the financial impact for them. So your duty as on the fundraising side is really to focus on impact and legacy, and what does this donor want to accomplish with their gift? How can they leave a lasting legacy for their community? And really you're looking to inspire the donor and really talk to them about the impact that this gift can make. So if you're speaking with a planned gift donor, your objectives are to be understanding the donor's experiences, values, worries, relationships, all of the reasons that they might choose to go in this direction with their gift, and learning about what they want to do in the world and what kind of future they want to see here in their community, and talk to them about the work you will do with their gift that aligns with that vision that they have for their community once they are no longer here. I know a lot of fundraisers who've been doing fundraising for a really long time and sometimes shy away from planned giving because it feels complicated, because we're not tax advisors or financial people, in our expertise. And my biggest takeaway here is that piece isn't your job. Your job is to talk about legacy, impact, the future community that you are creating with your work, and how that aligns with the future that the donor would like to know is carrying on once they're not here anymore. And I should also share, Stacy mentioned a lot about gifts of real estate as the planned gift. That's certainly one kind, but these principles also work for people who might be making a gift through their will, that's naming you as the beneficiary of a retirement plan, or just making an outright gift of cash through their will. These are all the same principles, whether it's the actual property or whether it's another kind of bequest that they're trying to put together for their planned giving. So then let's talk about campaigns. And if that's a fundraising campaign is I know not everybody on this webinar is in a fundraising role. And so just to make sure we're all on the same page here, when I'm talking about a fundraising campaign, I'm talking about a strategy for raising money for a specific case for support. That in planning the campaign, we are thinking about all parts of the donor cycle, from how we identify prospects who might give to that campaign, how we cultivate those relationships, how we actually ask them to give to the campaign, that moment of asking, and the stewardship, how to build the relationship and follow up with them after the campaign comes to an end. A campaign often includes several different modes of making an actual ask, maybe something in the mail, emails, meeting with people in person, maybe an event. There's kind of all kinds of modalities of giving and asking, and often campaigns, especially ones that might be longer term, that are seeding those bigger funds, often include multiple ways of giving at multiple times to roll up to that final gift amount. So on the next slide, I have some key characteristics of a successful fundraising campaigns. They are time bound, so you do have a clear start and end date, and you are communicating that to your potential funders so that they have a reason to take action now. This isn't just something someday you're asking them to contribute to. And then because you've defined the time limits of the campaign for yourself as you're planning it, you also then in that planning phase, lay out a really clear calendar of communications internally of how and when you're going to communicate with your community, both to cultivate them and to make the asks. And that we really recommend that as you're planning campaigns, you're really thinking about this in advance. It's not, again, what we're trying to do is not live in that reactive mode where we're reacting, but when we're laying things out, the communication that we would like to deploy, that gives you more room in the moment to actually respond to your donors and build the relationships with them. Certainly a good campaign has a goal. If you are doing project-based fundraising, your goal is probably pretty straightforward because it's the dollar amount you need to make that acquisition. If you are thinking about doing a larger, longer time campaign to seek an acquisition fund or grow an acquisition fund, that might be a goal then that's a little bit more, it's something you have a little bit more control over setting. And you might want to be setting that to something that feels realistic for actually getting things started. And then maybe you're building into that fund over time with other smaller campaigns. Good campaigns have segmentation. So you're thinking about your donor segments, who all is going to be part of this campaign. And again, you're thinking about the entire fundraising cycle. So it's not just the moment of asking, but really thinking about each step of identifying, cultivating, soliciting, and stewarding. I know I'm going a little bit fast. I know we don't have too much time. So again, this is meant to be kind of a high level overview, and happy to share some more resources about campaigns afterward. I think I have just one more slide here. Maybe two. So some steps to building a fundraising campaign. You want to make sure that if you are going to embark on this, whether it's a short-term project-based one or a longer-term, bigger campaign for putting together a fund, that you are being really thoughtful about each step, that you want to prepare for it, schedule out what you're going to, what your communication points are going to be, take the time to generate your content. Again, not reactively, but really put together the full scope of what you want to say and when and how, and then focus on launching so that in the moment of launching, you can be responsive to the feedback you're getting from your community. Don't forget stewardship. Certainly as people give, you want to make sure that you are not just acknowledging their gift, but really bringing them into the work that you're doing, communicating the impact that they're having by making this happen, sharing case studies of actual projects that you're doing so they can really connect their giving to what you're doing with it. And then certainly take time to evaluate the success of your campaign against your original goals. That will really help you strengthen the future campaigns as you do this again over time. And so, the last slide is going to be just, I think I saw maybe a question pop up about, oh, okay, one more. So this one is about building your case for support in your narrative. That's going to be really what your what's most inspiring to your donors to get involved is how are you communicating with them? What are you doing with this? The funds that they're giving. And if you have a short-term campaign, it might be very specific to to that one project again, or if you're doing a campaign around a case for support for a larger fund, then you are communicating more of the overall mission and work of your organization and how these different projects make that happen. And then one more slide, I think. I keep saying that. You guys are gonna work it. So a little bit of ways to think differently about the per project campaign versus the acquisition fund campaign. Again, the per project one is a little bit more reactive. It really depends on what properties become available and when. You don't know the story in the case for support that you want to put forward if you don't know the property that you're raising money for and what the story is there. So inherently, they often become much shorter term turnaround. It's most likely that once you find out that story and that opportunity, you probably have a very small window of time to raise the funds to be the ones to make that happen. But without knowing that, you can't put forward the case for support. Those goals will be smaller, generally speaking, than the large fund that we're talking about as an alternative. Probably a few months, like I mentioned, timeline-wise, a few months to execute that, and a very narrow case for support focused on that particular property. An acquisition fund campaign it's really almost, the other side of that spectrum. It's a very proactive strategy. You are building a fund to use for future opportunities as they arise. So your goal will be larger. You certainly want to create a fund where you can then be flexible to a lot of opportunities as they come up. Potentially that's creating an endowment. And I have here the definition of an endowment. That's when you're actually then taking that and investing it and using the investment income to provide more funding for the organization. That's an option, but I also want to share that it doesn't have to be something as complicated as an endowment. You could just kind of build this fund that you're using for acquisitions. There would be a longer term timeline to plan and execute this, potentially even a few years, depending on the total goal that you choose. And the case for support would focus more on your work in general and your overall mission and the work that you do rather than focusing on a specific project. But you would want to use specific projects that you've done in the past for storytelling and examples. So there is certainly room for storytelling per project in a larger fund campaign, but those are put forward as examples rather than restricting the money and directing the money towards those particular projects. So I will stop, Dahlia. I'm sure there's lots more questions. I know there were some more for Stacy. I'll let you kind of call out the ones we've got the best time for.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. So yeah, we know that we said it was going to be a longer webinar and then we shortened it. And then now we have some time. So we definitely want to make time if there are questions. We don't want people to feel rushed. I saw a couple, maybe one for you, Lori, just since you just shared around how long is a fundraising campaign timeline. Maybe you can say it's obviously for the campaign that's specific to a property that would be shorter. You said ideally a few months I saw on the slide, but we know that sometimes acquisitions need to happen in 30, 60 days. What would you say if you're thinking about this more longer term acquisition fund? What would be a good timeline?
Yeah, so I don't have a specific amount of time that's right for everybody. So it's not a straightforward answer on X number of months is the right timeline. What I will share is that you want to set yourself a timeline that allows you the chance to do those steps that I laid out. And that really can depend how much time it takes you to do that will depend on who's on the team. Do you have to engage outside fundraising help because this is new to you, or do you have a fundraiser on your staff? How much bandwidth does your leadership team have to spend time really preparing and digging in? How much attention do you have from your board, or what kind of volunteer leadership can you gather and galvanize around this work? And sometimes that's all at the ready, and sometimes you have to build even that part. So it's going to vary per organization and your capacity, but I will say don't short yourself on the preparation piece because your campaign, not only will it feel stressful to you to execute if you haven't had a chance to prepare, but it's not ultimately going to be as successful as if you really take that time to distinctly prepare your case for support, really think about the prospects you have that you would approach to give to you at the beginning of this campaign, put together your materials, activate some of your key leadership in the community who can help spread this message for you beyond your current community so that you're actually bringing in more people to your work through the campaign. And that can be, I've worked with an organization that spent a year in their preparation phase, but their goal was over $30 million. And I've worked on organizations that have spent a few months on the preparations and their goals were smaller. So there's no one right answer other than to say, it is important that you feel like you're ready to be successful. Otherwise, you're going to launch this big campaign for this big fund and it's going to feel chaotic and you're not likely to, it's not only going to feel chaotic, but then you're also not likely to be super successful. And then that makes it hard to kind of go for this again in the future.
Thanks, Lori. Couple questions for Stacy. And if you have more questions, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand. The chat is fire, by the way. We have Jean Diaz here who talked about St. Joseph CLT has a revolving acquisition fund. I'm sure there's plenty of knowledge to share there too. So Stacy, two questions for you. One around, did you need to get any buy-in from neighboring property owners for any of these plan giving case studies that you shared? If you can talk about any community work that happened there. And then also there was a comment around like what legacy of repair work means and to leave a legacy. Has there been conversation around leaving land to native-led CLTs?
Yeah, thank you. The first one I can certainly answer by, it makes me chuckle a little bit because the community is so small in Point Reyes Station where we work that most of the land neighbors surrounding the Cypress property are friends of CLAM, like very close-in donors that we know. So no, there was no opposition or problem there. I think people were really pleased. And I think in general with the other acquisitions that we've had, we haven't needed to do much community outreach, I think, because we've known the adjacent neighbors in some form or another. So that hasn't been an issue for us. I do think that communication is always good up front with any project, particularly when it has to do with, permitting or new construction or adding a unit, but we haven't experienced any opposition to what we've been doing. And then the other question about legacy of repair. There are a couple Miwok tribal communities that are active in the Point Reyes area, and we've been in communication with them on a couple different projects, but not on these in particular. So in that sense, we haven't really reached out in terms of legacy or reparation for Native peoples.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Feel free to raise your hand or put them in the chat. And just a friendly reminder to everyone, the recording and slideshow will be emailed out after the webinar. Laura, did you have a question?
Stacy, there was one more question about the permitting process and talking about the permitting process with the Cypress project.
Yes, so we agreed in our purchase and sale agreement to take on the permitting responsibility for any of the improvements. So how we work with that is that we've prepared the site plan, we prepared the contractor bids, we prepared sort of the scope of work, et cetera. And then we communicate and collaborate with the owner. It's nice because she obviously has a lot of knowledge about her own property. So we can ask like, oh, what's the background with this system or that system that's failing or not failing, or she'll point things out that aren't obvious to us. So it's been nice, but we have been taking the lead on all of the permitting and contracting. So it's working out in a nice way in that collaboration, if that answers the question.
Great. And then Bruce, yes, we did talk a little bit about the reverse mortgages earlier. And Robin offered themselves as a resource, as Stacy shared, that it's important to speak with an attorney on advising in terms of how to manage the reverse mortgage. Was there any other question that you had there, Bruce? Or Stacy, did you want to add?
Nope, that was it. Thank you.
Yeah, again, I'll preface this to say I'm not an attorney, I just play one on TV. But I would say that one of the things about the planned giving piece that we have is some of our some community members or some donors were curious about, oh, you know, is that safe or a good decision for the elder? And so there is a little bit of negative reputation in the financial community around reverse mortgages. So I think when you're also looking at these things, you really need to think about your organization's reputational risk and sort of what, you know, what could go south and what language do you want associated with the project and the relationship, and what language do you want not associated with the project and the relationship. So that's something to consider. And I know that a reverse mortgage sort of felt a little bit potentially predatory to some of our donors that we were talking to about this concept.
Thanks, Stacy. And then a question for Lori. Besides individual donors, what institutional funders give to capital campaigns these days?
Yeah, that's a great question. I unfortunately don't have just a list I can hand you. It completely depends what work you're doing and where you're located, and lots of factors on the institutional side. I will say I find that foundations do make it pretty clear whether they will or will not give to capital projects. So hopefully that makes it easy for you to rule out. If they say they don't give to capital projects, you should take that as truth that they do not. But I'd also say that the idea between doing a campaign for a fund, even though that fund is being built ultimately to purchase purchase properties, you may also use it for some of the work on the properties, like Stacy has mentioned, or some of the other pieces of your work that aren't necessarily the bricks and sticks of capital campaigns like we think of them of the olden day university, where you're asking an institution to give money so that you can build this new building. That's not exactly as straightforward, I don't think, with the work that we're talking about here. And so I would encourage you to call that campaign, not a capital campaign, but a campaign to raise this fund. It might open up doors for you a little bit more to some other kinds of donors that might have hard lines around capital campaigns if you're building something new. And it gives you space to talk more expansively about your work. It might keep some funders in the mix who would otherwise say no if you were just building a new wing to the hospital or something like that. It's a little bit harder to do that on a per project basis potentially, but when you're building the fund, again, you're talking more high level about your mission and being prepared to execute your mission in these different creative ways than you are talking about any one particular project.
That's great. Well, I want to thank both our speakers so much, Stacy and Lori, and I also want to thank the California Community Land Trust Network for partnering with this webinar, and thank each of you for showing up and for just lighting up the chat with these questions. I'll be sending out the recording and the slide deck after, and if you have questions, feel free to email us. Thank you so much, and thank you to our interpreters. Have a wonderful day.